let's bring in our panel from Providence, Rhode Island. Vladimir Golstein is an associate professor of Slavic Studies at Brown University. Also with us from Moscow is Pavel Felgenhauer. He's a defense analyst and columnist for Novaya Gazeta from Boston. Aurel Braun is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto, and John Sitilides is a geopolitical strategist with Trilogy Advisors here. He's here in Washington, D.C. Sitting right next to me. John, always a pleasure. Let me start with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who says, you know, he's unfairly being singled out. Let's listen to what he had to say.
First, the American side stated its intention to withdraw from the treaty. Then it began to look for the justifications for doing so. The primary justification is that we are violating something. At the same time, as usual, no evidence of violations on our part has been provided.
No evidence. We're violating something. No evidence. Where is the evidence?
President Putin is inaccurate in his explanation of what has transpired. As a matter of fact, Dan Coates, the Director of National Intelligence, just last week reported that Russia has been violating the INF Treaty for at least 4 years. The U.S. has quietly been putting the information forward, first under the Obama administration and now under the Trump administration. And from the DNI perspective, Russia has been denying the accusations. They have been demanding how the U.S. feels, on what determination, what basis this has been made, and then counter-responding in ways that, as Mr. Putin has made very clear, denote fury and Sturm und Drang, so to speak, as opposed to reason and facts. But the bottom line is we do know that the Russians have been violating the agreement for 4 years. The Trump administration about a month or so ago, back in October, actually called out the Russians. And now we have the formal declaration by Secretary Pompeo. There's 60 days to either come into compliance or the U.S. will withdraw from the treaty due to Russia's material breach.
Pavel, let me give you a chance to respond to what John just said. What's the point of view there in Russia?
Well, Russia has acknowledged that there is a cruise missile developed to be launched from a modified Iskander launcher. And of course, basically, the Iskander was always, from the beginning, designed as a hybrid launching system that could launch either ballistic missiles or cruise missiles. And cruise missiles, unlike ballistic, well, they're the range, it depends on how much fuel basically you have on board, so they're much more flexible than ballistic ones. But the Russian argument is that this cruise missile was never tested for more than 500 kilometers, so that means Russia technically is not in violation. And actually some American experts agree with that, that if you didn't test it, then it's not really fully a breach. And also what's also agreed by both sides, that Russia did not deploy any sizable numbers of these cruise missiles, no matter what their range is. Well, the arguments of both sides are, well, a bit, if not flimsy, at least they are not that serious to just simply pull this treaty off the table completely.
Vladimir, it's interesting. You have two perspectives there, and I was just reading also a senior research fellow at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research said that hard facts about Russia's development and use of banned missiles are difficult to pin down, and it seems like that's what we're hearing in terms of arguments. Vladimir Putin, he's vowed to react accordingly if the U.S. Withdraws from the treaty. What do you think that means?
Well, you know, what should be remembered, as John said, that these accusations were hurled at each other already since Obama time, since 2014. So something is definitely going on, and I would say it's going on both sides. You know, Russians have their charges against the United States. They say that their weapons, you know, which used as anti-missiles can easily turn into missiles, and so on. The question should be asked, why now? And I think it's not just about Russia, unfortunately, now. That Trump is very much interested in sort of expanding this program because he is aware of a kind of a rising threat of China. So I think that's kind of an elephant in the room. But, you know, having said that, we also should be aware that if the United States expands this program and puts this middle-range missiles in places like Poland and Romania, then Russia would be forced to answer in kind, and it will produce some kind of escalation. So this is like, a two-pronged approach, concrete things, concrete exchange of accusations, concrete sort of ultimatums, and a bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that the United States feels the need to assert its hegemony against Russia and against China, and feels the need to sort of build up its military machine.
Aurel, from a context standpoint, there's been a lot of criticism of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. He can't be trusted. He's aggressive. But there hasn't been a lot of self-reflection on the part of the West. There were some documents about these assurances given to Gorbachev by the West, not just the United States and not just Jim Baker, who said we're not going to go 1 inch forward when it comes to NATO expansion. I mean, these are reassurances from Kohl in Germany, Thatcher in England, Mitterrand in France, Bush as well here in the United States, that there wouldn't be expansion of NATO, and yet it seems as though the Russians and the Soviet leaders before that were rather bitter, feeling as though they were misled or betrayed. There's almost a dozen of Warsaw Pact nations now part of NATO.
Well, I think the Russians would have to have been extraordinarily naive to have believed in those kind of informal assurances. They have not been able to produce concrete documents that point to any kind of treaty, any kind of binding obligation. When you look at the Russian approach to international law, they are very meticulous, very careful, and there are no loose ends. That is not the situation here. So I think this is a diversionary tactic. The problem has been that Russia has behaved very assertively, and Russia has exhibited under Vladimir Putin a talent to alienate even countries that are very favorably inclined to negotiation and accommodation. If you look at Russian relations with the Nordic states, Sweden, Finland, those relations have deteriorated because of actions under the Putin administration. So yes, it is never the case that only one side is exclusively at fault, but here, if you look at Russian action, whether it's Ukraine, the prodding and probing of air defenses in the West, submarines off the coast of Sweden, these are assertive policies that try to look for foreign policy successes, because sadly for Russia, domestically, there are not too many domestic policy successes. And you can see that in...
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
And you can see that in the drop in support in the opinion polls for Mr. Putin. There's been a dramatic decline in his support.
Well, Pavel, let me ask you about the expansion of NATO, though. That has been a bone of contention for Vladimir Putin for some time, hasn't it?
Well, the expansion of NATO beginning from the 90s has been straining with Russian relations with the West. It's been seen as a kind of, well, Russia being excluded and kind of pushed into a corner. Though from the formally speaking, of course, no obligations were really broken. I discussed this personally with Mikhail Gorbachev, and he explained that, and he has done so publicly, that actually the assurances were about the unification of Germany, and that German or other NATO military units will not be moved into the former GDR after unification. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen even today. So and there was nothing about Poland or Estonia, which was then actually part of the Soviet Union anyway. So formally things were not broken assurances, but informal kind of understanding in Russia. Yes, a lot of Russians feel that they have been isolated and pushed to a side. That does not really excuse some rather rash Russian foreign policy moves, and both sides have, and it's quite clear that both sides did a lot to get into the position we are today, when we're sort of looking again at each other through the barrel of a gun.
Yeah, through a barrel of a gun. The treaty, of course, John, as you remember, U.S. President Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev agreeing to this in 1987, essentially credited with ending the Cold War. So is this a step back in the wrong direction, with the barrels of the guns pointed at one another, a heating up of the Cold War, if you will?
Not necessarily, Mike. And even though it was a great moment in the history of the Cold War to have this INF treaty that for the first time actually banned an entire class of weapons, the intermediate range missiles, it was appropriate for the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and culminating in the 1980s. And as you mentioned, several years later, the Warsaw Pact collapsed, and then 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. But we're also dealing now in 2018 with 21st century challenges. The world has changed drastically since the US and the Soviet Union were in a Cold War. And I think also, besides the fact that the administration considers Russia to be in material breach of the INF Treaty for technical and legal reasons, I think, as Vladimir said earlier, there is another dimension to this position on the part of the Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, and that is China, which has been able to develop intermediate range missiles because it's not signatory to the INF Treaty. And I think going forward, the administration will be looking, A, to renegotiate a treaty with Russia to ban these missiles for nuclear and conventional purposes, but also to bring China into a treaty so that China is not able to develop these weapons, this arsenal in the Pacific, in order to achieve what they call area access denial to the United States forces that are defending its allies in the event of a conflict in Asia.
Aurel, you wrote back in July about Donald Trump's performance in Helsinki, that the president may say one thing, the administration does another. And you also pointed out that Russia is no longer a superpower. Revisit some of the points that you made in that article, and how does that frame things as we look forward?
Well, one of the things that this means is that United States is a global power and it has global interests. And this is why for the United States, it is important to look not only at Russia, but also at China. And I think that bringing China into the treaty would be a good thing because it would be a global approach. This treaty also had loose ends. It did not cover certain kinds of missiles, such as the ones that are air-launched or sea-launched. So that would have to be covered as well. But there is that kind of asymmetry with Russia, and there is also the reality that no one really wants to have a new arms race, but the country that can least afford to have a new arms race is Russia.
So I think I'm hearing a lot of the same sort of points. You bring China into it, you come up with an agreement, you have these three major powers, they all sign on. But how do you get there from this point where you have Vladimir Putin was supposed to come to Washington, D.C., that's been put on the shelf. They were supposed to have a dialogue, Trump and Putin at the G20, that was put on the shelf. You have a trade war looming between the United States and China. How do you get a dialogue and a treaty going when you have all of this disagreement going on between all these countries? So let me start with you, John, but I want to go round robin and get some thoughts on that.
Well, as you're making perfectly clear, nobody said this is going to be easy. But that's not the question. The question is it essential? And perhaps Russia is the country that is least positioned to be able to keep up in an arms race right now because its economy is so relatively feeble compared to that of the US and China. But I think also the fact that every other member of the NATO alliance is in agreement that Russia is in material breach of the agreement solidifies the diplomatic argument for the United States withdrawing from the agreement, even as one of your panelists said, nobody wants to see the withdrawal. But if Russia forces the hand of the U.S. and the NATO alliance, so be it. The question will be, what will the United States respond with in Asia? Will they begin to place these types of missiles in countries that are near the Pacific Rim region in order to try to goad China into entering into a framework for negotiating so you have a three-way, and then possibly see how you deal with countries down the road such as Iran and North Korea, which are also capable of building these types of missiles? Of course, the problem with those countries is they're rogue regimes, and no one really expects them to legally abide by any treaty that they're signatory to.
Vladimir, that sounds like a rather dangerous scenario moving forward, missiles being planted all over the place. What's your view in terms of bringing all three of these parties together and coming up with some type of agreement?
Well, what I want to stress for starters is that Russia is not in such a weak position as your guest suggesting. First of all, Russia is not the Soviet Union, which had to maintain a big Warsaw bloc within the countries which, very frequently didn't want it. So Russia had to keep them all sort of under control with military garrisons and everything. Now they totally changed their military doctrine. They are very defensive. They rely on diplomacy and they rely on the deterrence. So they actually can go on with their, arms race as much as you want. They would just develop more very sophisticated nuclear arms which can reach and wipe out Washington or Texas or whatever you want, and that will be enough. They don't need to maintain, Poland or this or that, or try to answer kind in kind. So, and plus, the Russian economy is not that weak. This is like old news, and from Cold War era. I go to Russia every time. I read reports. It's very diversified economy, and it's moving ahead fine. But the bigger picture is that United States still thinks from the position of top dog, from a position of top power. And this recent speech of Pompeo in Brussels was stressing that, yeah, that we are still continuing to be the leader of this new democratic order. While in fact, this unilateral approach is kind of old-fashioned already. All your guests stress that the world changed. We now have major powers. If not Russia, then China. So basically, we have to have diplomatic relationship between all the countries sitting down and discussing and talking and acknowledging that the new reality is this multilateral approach to things. But for some reason, this Pompeo and others stress that no, we will still be the top dog, we still do things. And by the way, just think what's happened yesterday when Trump decided to appoint this absolutely ignorant person to United Nations who doesn't even know, on whose side America and Germany were fighting during the Second World War. And this is the approach to foreign affairs, which does work in 21st century. And I think the United States has to wake up and start sort of dealing with the new reality. Otherwise, it'll be very dangerous.
Yeah, he's referring to the spokesperson at the State Department who's going to be nominated to take the place of Nikki Haley at the UN. You mentioned Mike Pompeo. We have some sound from his event there in Brussels. Let's listen to that now.
Russia's actions gravely undermine American national security and that of our allies and partners. It makes no sense for the United States to remain in a treaty that constrains our ability to respond to Russia's violations. We had a treaty that had two parties, only one of which was compliant. That's not an agreement. That's just self-restraint.
Pavel, I want to get your thoughts on what the Secretary of State had to say there.
The fact is that Russia does have missiles that can deploy more if the treaty disappears somewhere in several months. Land-based cruise missiles, more or less the same that Russia has on planes or ships or submarines, but on land-based, on trucks basically, that's just much 10, 20 times cheaper to deploy and to maintain. And the United States does not have anything right now to deploy on land that it could deploy, but doesn't because the treaty is in place. And won't have anything most likely for years to come. And deploying against China, well, not on sea, again, it doesn't mean, well, it's possible, I don't know, in Taiwan, maybe Vietnam, and South Korea, but again, it's not really that very serious option. And I don't think that China right now is going to begin negotiations to destroy 90% or over 90% of its nuclear-capable missile force. So that means we're going to be in a situation with no treaty, no restraints, kind of back to the good old days of the 70s or even 60s, free for all in nuclear missile deployment. And that, if not immediately, quickly nothing's going to change dramatically. But further on, there's going to be very stressful situations when actually maybe Americans do deploy something in Europe, say, aimed at European Russia. And the flight time of these new missiles could be just several minutes, and that would really destabilize the nuclear balance.
The good old days of the 60s and 70s didn't seem so good when we look back on them. It's interesting, though, you see a lot of support from NATO allies to the U.S. position. In fact, let's listen to NATO Secretary General as he addressed the issue with Russia. Let's listen to his sound.
Russia has developed, tested, and also fielded new missiles, SSC-8, over years. These missiles are mobile, hard to detect, nuclear capable, and they are putting the INF Treaty in jeopardy. The United States is in full compliance with the INF Treaty. There are no new US missiles in Europe, but there are new Russian missiles in Europe.
Aurel, just how concerned would you say European countries are at the possibility of the scenario that we're hearing of a new arms race?
Well, many of the European countries are very concerned. So if you look at the Dutch have been very, very tough on this. They clearly stated that missiles like the SSC-8 are a threat. There's more reluctance in the case of Germany because they don't want to see any kind of arms race. But the problem is that Russia has consistently overplayed its hand. They did not have to go down this route. They cannot really afford, as I noted, to get into an arms race. It is news to most of us that the Russian economy is diversified, and it would be great news to the Russian people that the economy is doing well. Neither one of those is the actual case. And we're looking at a long-range kind of development. It's absolutely correct that the United States will not be able to deploy immediately, but in the longer term, the strategic picture, that does not favor Russia. It is also the case that the relations between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump now seem to be taking a less positive note. There was no meeting at the G20 meeting, and that was because Russia acted against Ukraine in the Kerch Strait. We see harsher statements coming from Mr. Peskov, the spokesman for Mr. Putin, and none of this helps towards smoothing over differences. So the prospects of resolving this within the next 60 days do not look particularly good.
Yeah, the harder line coming on both sides. John, you know, just this week, Mikhail Gorbachev and George Shultz, the former U.S. Secretary of State, wrote this op-ed piece. I think we have some of it, we can put it up on the screen. This is part of it. Abandoning the INF Treaty would be a step toward a new arms race, undermining strategic stability and increasing the threat of miscalculation or technical failure, leading to an immensely destructive war. The answer to the problems that have come up is not to abandon the INF Treaty, but to preserve and to fix it. We heard Donald Trump complain bitterly about NAFTA, but he and his negotiators dove right in, and they came up with a new treaty. Why not just dive right back in, have a negotiation, try and fix where the problems are?
Well, if I heard Secretary of State Pompeo accurately, we're not withdrawing tomorrow. There's 60 days for the Russians to determine how they're able to re-enter a framework for discussions or to come back into compliance. But there is this 60-day notice to Russia, after which, if Russia does not comply or is not able to respond to the accusations, the U.S. will withdraw. Look, these are the challenges that we face when we're talking about international security. There is no perfect solution, and we are facing a very difficult situation, both with Russia cheating on the agreement from a U.S. perspective and China able to build up its arsenal because it's not party to any signatory, it's not signatory to any agreement. For the U.S., is this really a position to remain insecure in Europe and to allow our allies to become increasingly insecure in Asia? Or do we enter this new era, which may be uncertain, there's no doubt about it, but to try to bring Russia, China, and the U.S. into a trilateral agreement? And it's going to be risky getting there, but it's better than allowing the situation to continue as it is, where the U.S. is the only party that is adhering to the agreement, Russia cheats with impunity, and China builds because there's no legal restraint there.
Pavel, one final question for you. You talked about the good old days of the 60s and 70s, but I remember back when there was the Cold War, you had people who were hardliners, but you also had people pushing for détente. It doesn't seem like we're hearing a lot of that these days. What needs to happen for the temperature to come down and the dialogue to begin?
Well, maybe it had to really get worse. I mean, in the 80s, especially in 83, when there was this Able Archer exercise in the West, in NATO, and Russia were expecting that the war is becoming imminent. I mean, the Russian leadership. They were already in bunkers. So yes, it had to go really bad, and there were deployments of very able American missiles in Europe, the Euro missile crisis. And actually that threat brought both sides to the negotiating table, and Moscow accepted Ronald Reagan's zero option. So maybe it should get worse before it gets better. That's also a way. but in the process, we could actually go over the brink. That's also a threat. So it's a very dangerous thing going to the brink and then at the brink to find some kind of quid pro quo.
Well, we'll leave it there. Some food for thought for all of us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.